Hi, everyone. Hope you're all having a great day and feeling very happy. I say that especially because that ties into what we are talking about today. We are talking about motivation, emotion, and personality. Specifically, we are going to start with different theories of emotions and then kind of talking a little bit more about specific emotional expressions that we have. So, we are covering modules 56 and 57 here today in this video. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing to define is what is emotion. It is the response of a whole organism involving physiological arousal, expressive behaviors, and conscious experience. So physiological arousal, that's kind of like your biology side of things. Expressive behaviors, that's more like what are you outwardly showing. And then conscious experience is how is your brain interpreting what you're feeling right now. And we will see throughout this module here how each of those three pieces kind of ties together with our different theorists' perspectives on emotion. So if you want, you can take a second and look at that. Can you identify those three different parts of emotion there in these individuals? So how do those three pieces fit together? There's kind of two big questions that research in emotion answers. First is, does your bodily arousal come before or after your emotional feelings? And second, how do thinking, so your cognition, and feeling interact? Does cognition always come before emotion or vice versa? Some of our historical emotion theories, as well as our current research, are trying to answer these questions here. So, as always with theories, none of them are 100% correct or proven, but instead they're different suggestions by different people who have a varying amount of support with these different theories here. So, the first one we're going to talk about is the James Lange theory of emotion. And this theory states that our experience of emotion is our awareness of our physiological responses to an emotion arousing stimulus. The big takeaway here with the James Lange theory is that a stimulus leads to arousal, which leads to emotion. And I will show you an example of that in just 1 second. But by the way, the name James in James Lange, that James is William James, who we have talked about before back in Unit 1. So he is still making an appearance here in our psych world. So William James has this quote that says, "We feel sorry because we cry. We feel angry because we strike, and afraid because we tremble." So basically he's saying your body does something first, then you feel an emotion. So visually, we can see that here with this chart. For example, if we're saying there's some kind of stimulus, so that's like what's the external thing that's happening. So for example, you see a car coming towards you, which is pretty scary, obviously. So the car is coming, you see that. Then you have your physiological arousal in some way. So your body responds. The way your body responds in this case might be that your heart starts pounding. And then finally, you feel the emotion, in this case, fear. So that is what James Lange, this theory here, is saying. There's a stimulus, then arousal, then emotion. But we have some other people who disagree with that. So we have Walter Cannon and his graduate student Philip Bard, who disagree. They said, does a racing heart signal fear or anger or love? Do we really know exactly what the racing heart means? So they're saying that the body's responses, our heart rate, perspiration, body temperature, they're all so similar and they can change too slowly to end up causing your different emotions. So then what do Cannon and Bard say? Their theory of emotion, sometimes it's called the thalamic theory of emotion, they say that an emotion arousing stimulus simultaneously triggers two things at once, a physiological response and the subjective experience of emotion. So visually, to see that here, in that same example before, Cannon and Bard are saying, you see the car coming, that's the stimulus, and then at the same time and independently of each other, you are both having that physiological arousal and feeling that emotion. So your heart starts pounding and you feel fear at the same time. It's not that one leads to the other. Don't forget the thalamus is the part at the top of the brainstem that is like your brain's sensory control center or switchboard, where basically a lot of your senses go through the thalamus first, and then it directs which part of the brain it should go to, except for smell. Don't forget about that part. So the Cannon-Bard thalamic theory says that the stimulation or arousal and emotion are a combined response to a stimulus. After exposure to a stimulus, sensory signals are transmitted to the thalamus. The thalamus receives the signal and relays it to two different brain structures, the amygdala and the brain cortex. So that's just kind of explaining a little bit more about how they're saying the thalamus is involved. Honestly, I'd say that's not necessarily the most important part to know of their theory. It's more important to know what are they saying basically in that image back here. What are they saying happens when you feel an emotion? So here's a little bit more about how your amygdala and sympathetic nervous system work with your emotions. I'm not going to talk about this here, but you can feel free to go back and take a look at that on your own. So let's compare those two theories here, the James Lange theory and Cannon-Bard theory. The James Lange theory says physiological responses occur first, and they are the cause of our emotions. So you feel some physiological thing, then you feel an emotion. The Cannon-Bard theory was saying that the emotion and physical response occur at the same time. One does not depend on the other. You can go ahead and try this out on your own a little bit there. So how do thinking and feeling interact? Both the James Lange theory and Cannon-Bard theory take into account your physiological responses and that interplaying with emotions. But what about cognition? What about your active thoughts? How does that play into your feelings of emotion? So we've got yet another theory that comes along by Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer. They brought up this idea of appraisal, which is kind of your cognitive interpretation of something that is happening, of a stimulus, which they are saying then influences your emotions. So they say that our physical reactions and our thoughts, so your perceptions, your memories, interpretations, those things together create your emotion. So it's called the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. How's that for a nice, long, confusing title for you? The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion says that there's two parts to it: physical arousal and cognitive appraisal. Those things then lead to an emotional experience. So here theirs is visually. So we've got your stimulus, the sight of the car again. Then simultaneously at the same time, you've got that your heart starts pounding, that's your physiological arousal, and your cognitive label of, oh, I'm afraid. You take those two things together and that leads to this emotion of, like I'm feeling fear right now. So that is what Schachter and Singer's two-factor theory of emotion is saying. Also, Schachter and Singer say that there's this thing called the spillover effect, which is kind of interesting. And they're essentially saying that feelings of arousal spill over from one event to the next. So for example, you might be watching a soccer match or even playing in one and feeling really angry and frustrated. Then something that happens afterwards, you might still be carrying over those feelings of anger, and maybe you get home then to see your family or something and you like lash out at someone. And it's just because you were angry about what happened at the game, but that feeling still kind of carries over and spills over into your other interactions. So this is kind of interesting. The way that they decided to research that is they told some college men, they injected them with the hormone epinephrine, and that triggers feelings of arousal. So they told one group of men that the injection would help to test their eyesight. The other group was told that they might experience arousal because of the drug. So they were told like the truth about what the drug might do. Then they went to sit in a waiting room where there was someone waiting there who was a Confederate, meaning they were part of the experiment, and they were acting either kind of euphoric, super happy, or irritated by something. So then those participants in the study began to feel their heart race, their body flush, their breathing become more rapid. The group of subjects who were told that the drug is going to lead to them feeling a bit of arousal, they then attributed that arousal that they felt to the drug and did not really feel much emotion themselves. They were like, oh, this is just the drug, it's not me. Those who were told the injection would not produce any arousal, but instead it would help their eyesight, they then caught the apparent emotion of the other person in the waiting room. So if the other person was acting euphoric, then they were too. Or if they were acting kind of irritated, then they also were. So it's just kind of interesting to see how cognition does in fact matter. So like a stirred up state can be experienced as one emotion or another, depending on how you interpret and label it. And we have seen that in lots of different studies. So it does kind of depend on, your body doesn't just have its own reactions, but there is probably some kind of other added aspect of what are your thoughts about these feelings that you're having. Really, really important AP exam tip here. You do absolutely need to make sure you can know the differences and similarities between each of those three theories: the James Lange, Cannon-Bard, and Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion. I've got to be honest, I've never really found a super good way to be able to remember the difference between each theory. Especially it's hard because they're just people's names and there's two names in each one. However, I do have to say, a lot of times I have found for me the best way to remember is by looking at this image right here. And I just truly kind of like embed this in my memory, and I see when I'm trying to figure out which one is which. I just remember the order of what they are in this picture. Is like on the left was James Lange, the middle was Cannon-Bard, the right was Schachter-Singer, and then what did the image look like with them for trying to remember their emotion. If you have a better method for them, please, 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 please let me know, because I am very anxious to hear better ways to memorize them. But I just recommend looking at this picture here. So this is a great way to summarize all three of them together at once with the same situation here. On that note, let's do a little question here. The Cannon-Bard theory of emotion states that, which of these here? Go ahead and take a moment to read through them all. Pause the video if you need to, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you our answer here. If you look back to that chart, Cannon-Bard was here in the middle. So the correct answer would be letter C. Physiological response and emotion occur independently and simultaneously. So both of those things happen at the same time. One does not depend on the other. That is the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. All right, so back to that cognition part of things. Yes, unfortunately, we're not done with just those three theories of emotion there. Those are three that are very often compared next to each other, but there are kind of two other theories that are kind of grouped together that are newer with all these theories of emotion as well. So, do we always need to interpret our arousal before we can experience an emotion? Psychologist Robert Zients did not think so. He contended that we actually have many emotional reactions that are apart from or even happen before our conscious interpretation of a situation. So, what does that mean here? He's kind of saying there's two different pathways for emotion that might happen in our brain, and it's called this two-track brain in his theory. So either some kind of stimulus, some sensor input is routed to the cortex by the thalamus, and then to the amygdala, or it is transmitted directly to the amygdala through the thalamus. So there's kind of these like two routes that some kind of stimulus might come in as. So we've got the high road is one of those two options there. And the high road, Zients is arguing, is your more complex emotions. So things like hatred and love, those are more of those like abstract concepts, and you have to kind of think through them a bit more of how am I feeling here. So he's saying that is something on the high road that would then travel through the thalamus to the brain's cortex. It's analyzed there, and then it is sent to the amygdala. Then you're like feeling your emotion. So that's the high road. That's that more complex, let me take it slow kind of thing and figure this all out here. On the other side, we have the low road, which was kind of more thought of by Joseph Ledoux. And he is saying that that's more of your simple emotions and where they are kind of processed. So things like your likes, dislikes, fears, they don't really require you to think about them quite as much. So he's saying that those bypass the cortex. So with the low road, a fear-provoking stimulus would travel from the eye or the ear via the thalamus directly to the amygdala. So it's kind of this shorter path to feeling that emotion then. So how do these Schachter-Singer and Zients-Ledoux theories of emotion compare? So this is the same image here both times, just so you're aware of that, but you're supposed to focus on different pieces of it. So with the Schachter-Singer theory, that is saying our appraisal and labeling of events determine our emotional responses. So as you can see here, there's also someone named Lazarus we're about to talk about in just a moment. But they're saying an event occurs, you have to have this cognitive judgment of how do I want to interpret this thing, then you feel emotion. Zions and Ledoux are saying that there's an event, and then sometimes you go that cognitive appraisal route, but otherwise you kind of just go straight to that emotional response. You might not have to have the conscious appraisal piece of it. So here is now Richard Lazarus, like I was just saying. He's got something else he says too. He's saying our brain processes vast amounts of information without our conscious awareness, and some emotional responses do not require conscious thinking. But how would we know what we're reacting to if we didn't in some way appraise the situation? That's what he's kind of posing here. So he then came up with this idea of saying that the appraisal that you're feeling, and again, appraisal is that like judgment of something happens, should I be afraid of this thing or should I not, that kind of thing. It might be an effortless thing that happens, you might not be conscious of it, but it's still happening. So whether or not to know something is good or bad, the brain's got to have some idea of what it is. So he is proposing that emotions arise when we appraise an event as harmless or dangerous. So he is again someone who is arguing cognitive appraisal is important, and it might be something that's happening without our conscious awareness, but there's still it's still happening. So, for instance, you appraise the sound of rustling bushes as the presence of a threat. Later, you might realize it was just the wind. All right, question number 2 here. Let's think about this. Which of the following is an example of cognitive appraisal? These are, again, kind of long, so go ahead and pause the video here. I'm going to go ahead and tell you the answer, though. It would be letter C. Sharika labels the arousal she's feeling as attraction because she's in the presence of a good-looking man. So she's consciously thinking about, how am I feeling right now? What is this attraction about? Oh, it's probably because there's a good-looking man right there. All right, so definitely make sure you know each of those different theories and theorists. Again, I apologize, no good way that I have found to memorize them. It's more just for me a visual thing of looking at like this chart here or the other images to try to remember each one. We do have some basic emotions though that some theorists have come up with. Kind of the 2 main researchers that go with studying basic emotions are Paul Ekman and Carol Izard. So they're both saying that there's kind of these universal emotions that we have, that regardless of what culture you live in, people tend to be able to pick up on these emotions. And a lot of them tend to agree that some of those basic emotions are anger, fear, disgust, sadness, and happiness. Also, Carol Izard then said, okay, well, maybe there's a few more, maybe there's 10. So joy, interest or excitement, surprise, sadness, anger, disgust, contempt, fear, shame, and guilt. And she's saying that you can see those present in infancy. So that's something that's kind of more on that side of it's a nature thing, not so much a nurture thing, since you see them more like at birth. And then some other people say pride and love are also our basic emotions. So you can take a second and see if you can figure out what do you think these different emotions are that these infants are feeling here. There is a little bit more information here in this module about the autonomic nervous system, which is your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. I'm not going to spend time here talking about that because we have covered this back in module 10, which was in unit 2. So feel free to pause and look through these slides a little bit more on your own or in the textbook, but I'm not going to be talking about them here right now. There's a little bit more there. Okay, so I do want to mention here with polygraphs, these are something that are often used in the world of like the criminal justice world and everything. And so polygraphs are thought to hopefully try to identify, is someone lying? They're more commonly referred to as lie detector tests. So polygraphs measure emotion-linked autonomic arousal, which is reflected in changes in breathing, heart rate, and perspiration. So just like this shows here, someone's kind of hooked up to this contraption, and it's supposed to be showing things like their heart rate increasing, decreasing, those kinds of things. So how accurate are polygraphs? Honestly, they're not the most reliable thing. In college, I did study psychology, but I also studied criminal justice. And in most of the criminal justice classes I took, I always learned that polygraphs really are not a reliable thing. And that's because polygraphs pick up on arousal in some sort of way. But that's kind of where it's missing the human component of that cognitive appraisal. What is that arousal for? Because sometimes maybe people are just kind of jolted by the question that you're asking, even if they're totally innocent. Their heart rate might spike, but it's not because they did anything wrong. It's just instead like that was a triggering question in some sort of way. So that's kind of the downside of polygraphs is you can't necessarily explain why people are having the arousal that they're having. So you can see here that in about 1/3 of cases, polygraphs are wrong. So yes, maybe they're a little more right than wrong, but it's generally they are not considered good evidence in any sort of like court of law or anything. There's just a little more information about that there. All right, so that is it for this module number 56 about our theories of emotion. So let's go ahead and hop now to module number 57, which is about expressing emotion. So how do we communicate non-verbally? Obviously, there's lots of different ways. It can be through handshakes. It can be through like nods of the head. It can be through your eyes, like glancing, your eyes either communicating intimacy or your eyes darting around might show some kind of anxiety. Lots of different ways that without using any words at all, our facial expressions can communicate with people. Here's a great example. There's a Hindu classic dance that uses face and body to effectively convey 10 different emotions. So I think that that's really cool. If you think about it too, a big component of sign language is your facial expression. So obviously your hands are communicating in some sort of way, but your facial expression also really helps to convey a certain emotion as well. So all of that kind of ties together to be able to try to understand other people's thoughts a little better. Can humans detect nonverbal threats? Yes, we can. We can kind of sense subliminal threats that might be there, such as negative words like snake and bomb. An angry face will pop out of a crowd. If you see all these faces that are calm or happy, you will focus on the angry one the most. A lot of the reasoning for this being an evolutionary thing where your body is wired to protect itself and survive. So we are always looking out for threats of, is there something that's dangerous in my environment? And that's why our brains are kind of wired towards the negative with a lot of things. So we do most readily sense the emotion of anger. Unfortunately, there's some kind of sad research here that we do see in studies of physically abused children. They are quicker than other children to spot signals of anger. So if they're shown something here where it is this transition from a face of anger to fear or vice versa, fear to anger, they have seen that abused children's perceptions are sensitively attuned to the glimmers of danger that some non-abused children miss. So that is a case where nurture does play a part in our awareness of emotional expressions in other people. How can we readily detect deceit? Although our brains are pretty good at detecting emotions, we do find it difficult to detect deceit, like when someone's lying to you. So a reason for that is because the differences between liars and truth tellers are too minute for most people to detect. As I mentioned earlier, Paul Ekman, he is someone who does a lot with studying emotions, and he studies things called like micro emotions as well, which are these tiny, tiny little expressions that you have on your face that can kind of give away if you're lying or telling the truth. But it's this like really intense study to figure those out. It's not necessarily that our brains just naturally pick up on that with other people. So yeah, in many studies, people were 54% accurate in discerning truths from lies when other people are telling them, which is basically just leaving it up to chance. All right, so I really enjoy this next part here that we're going to talk about with detecting emotions and everything. So look at these two pictures. And by the way, this is Paul Ekman here in these two pictures. Which of these two do you think portrays a genuine smile? It is in fact the one on the right here, and you can see a couple differences there. So that is called a Duchenne smile. And a Duchenne smile is exactly that, a genuine smile where it includes your cheeks being raised and activating your eye muscles. So your eyes almost kind of get a little squinty, maybe a little wrinkly, but that is called a Duchenne smile because of the French physician who described it. So if you compare these two here, if you're just looking at like his mouth, like, yeah, sure, it's kind of like upturned. He looks like he's kind of smiling a bit. But if you look at this one here, look at how much more his eyes are kind of squinting, his cheeks are raised. So this is much more of an authentic, genuine smile. And super cool, they found studies where looking back at yearbook photos of people who were giving Duchenne genuine smiles versus those who were just kind of smiling for the picture, that those with those Duchenne smiles ended up having much more like happiness and success there throughout their lives. So it is kind of interesting that that does play a part in your expressions and your behaviors and everything too. Obviously, texting is something where it can get a little tricky because how many times have you sent a message or gotten a message where it's just totally misunderstood and you might have been saying something super nice, but the other person took it in a way of like, what are you talking about? Or maybe you're making a joke that didn't quite come across. So, I mean, it is kind of good that we have emojis now to help do some of that facial expression for us and like GIFs as well. So those things kind of help to overcome, remember the term egocentrism that Jean Piaget talked about, which is can you interpret someone else's thoughts basically, and the fact that their thoughts are different from your own. So emotions definitely help us to overcome that egocentrism. All right, kind of cool study here as well. This is a gender neutral face. Can you tell, is this a photo of a male or a female? What do you think? All right, now how about this one? Is that a male or a female? So very interesting that it is a gender neutral face they were creating here, but most people see it as a male when it has a more angry expression, and most people see it as a female when it has a happier expression with like a smile on it. And I do have to say that's how I interpreted both these pictures as well. So is that what you did? Kind of interesting to see. So then what do we know about gender and emotion? Is there any differences or similarities between genders and how they express emotions? So these researchers, Kring and Gordon, asked male and female students to watch film clips that were either sad, happy, or frightening. Then they watched the facial expressions of the men and women as they watched those clips. And here's what they found. So basically in the male and female reported emotions or the physiological responses, so like their heart rate, sweating, any of those kinds of things, they didn't really find a difference between genders. However, just observing their facial expressions, they found that women's faces showed much more emotions. So you can see women are the like orange bar here, and they definitely had many more facial expressions than compared to the group of men. So kind of interesting that maybe women tend to convey more with their facial expressions than men do. You probably figure this part out, but the meaning of gestures can definitely vary across cultures. Some things like shaking a hand, that's probably one that's more universal. But an example here is our former president, Richard Nixon, used the like A-OK sign before welcoming a crowd of Brazilians, but that is not the same meaning in Brazil. Instead, it's like a crude insult in Brazil. So definitely be careful about some different gestures that you might use. Okay, here's another test. Can you label these different faces of emotion here? What do you think each of these are signaling? You know, maybe like that one's probably happy. That one was kind of like surprised or something like that. As you can see here, these are what these are. So this is happiness, surprise, fear, sadness, anger, and disgust. And we were, again, Ekman and Izzard were kind of trying to look at different cultures and these facial expressions to see if people are able to pick up on the same facial expressions, regardless of what language you speak. Does your face speak the same language, pretty much, is what they're trying to figure out. And overall, they did find, yeah, in some cases, there were some universal emotions here. A smile is a smile. Everyone can understand that for the most part. Same with sadness. People can generally tell when you're sad. Some of those other emotional expressions here, surprise, fear, anger, disgust, Those are a little bit harder to pick up on in different cultures, but sometimes they still can be. So always keep that in mind. Your face definitely speaks, even if you are not physically speaking. So let's do a question here. People can most readily detect the emotion of what in a set of facial expressions? I'll tell you, this one's a little bit tricky here. It didn't necessarily outwardly talk about this. But think back to when I was saying evolutionarily, what's the easiest emotion for us to pick up on? That would be letter C, anger, because again, our brains are kind of wired towards the negative. We want to be able to sense threats in our environment. So we more easily pick up on expressions of anger in other people. So again, another thing in terms of applying that now to emotions, Darwin, one of our evolutionary psychologists, argued that in prehistoric times, before we were using words to communicate with each other, that they communicated threats, greetings, and submission with their facial expressions. So he is saying facial expressions are what help people to survive. So it's an adaptive trait to be able to understand facial expressions. Obviously, culture can impact your emotional expression as well, of how much of your emotions you're showing. In some of our more individualistic cultures, like we have here in North America, where it's kind of more focused on the individual and their own successes rather than let's try to do things for the greater good of everyone and kind of together as a whole society. We do see that there are more visible emotions in our individualistic cultures. On the other hand, in collectivistic cultures like Japan and China, they have less visible emotional displays. And the mouth, which is very expressive a lot of times in North Americans, conveys less emotions in a Japanese person than do the telltale eyes. So again, you can definitely see how different kinds of cultures, if it's individualistic versus collectivistic, makes a difference in how your emotions are expressed. Here's another example too of more individualistic culture versus collectivistic cultures and how their leaders tend to show facial expressions. Okay, so I do want you to think about this here. So this is kind of this last portion I want to talk about here that, again, is just my favorite. I love this. So remember William James, someone who was talking about emotion. He came to believe that we control emotions by going through the outward movements of any emotion we want to experience. So to feel cheerful, he advised, sit up cheerfully, look around cheerfully, and act as if cheerfulness were already there. So maybe like go ahead and do that. Maybe you're laying down in bed right now watching this. Go ahead and sit up for a second and just like act happy. Do you feel any more happy now? Most likely you probably do, if not for any other reason than feeling kind of silly because you just did this. So these really cool studies here showed that when they hooked up these different attachments to children's faces to either kind of pull their cheeks upwards or pull their cheeks downwards, that it created differences in their feelings of emotions. So they found that there is this theory, an idea called the facial feedback effect, which is the tendency of facial muscle states, man, say that 3 times fast, to trigger corresponding feelings such as fear, anger, or happiness. So basically, whatever your face shows can impact what you're feeling inside then too. So most students in that study they were doing reported feeling more happy than sad when their cheeks were raised upwards. And most students reported feeling more sad than happy when their cheeks were pulled downwards. So another cool study they've done with this that you can do on your own, make sure you go find a clean pen, pencil, straw, anything like that. But if you bite on that utensil that you have, you can notice that activates your cheeks and pulls them up. So if you do that, you can see my cheeks are raised, which is kind of imitating a smile. Then if you take it and you kind of scrunch up your nose and put it underneath your nose, that activates my frowning muscles here, where I'm kind of like that. So that then they have found does impact your feelings of happiness or sadness. So a super great trick for you if you're ever feeling kind of down and just like mentally you can't get yourself to a place where you're feeling better, literally just take a pencil, put it between your teeth, and that'll start to make you feel better. Is that not like the coolest thing? I just think that's amazing. And I gotta tell you, before I made this video, I was looking back over through these slides and everything, and I was just messing around with some of the things where they were talking about like smiling versus frowning. And I was kind of tired before making this video, but I started doing some of these things like making the Duchenne like genuine smile and putting the pencil in my teeth. And that literally started raising my mood, both because it's activating those muscles, which then my body will respond to. And also, like I said, I just felt kind of silly and it made me laugh a little bit. And that kind of started to raise my mood and give me a little bit more energy. So that's the facial feedback effect. And we also have the behavior feedback effect, which is pretty similar, but it's saying that our behaviors can influence our own and others' thoughts, feelings, and actions. So, besides just your facial expressions, if you do those things like, sitting up real tall and cheery and happy and skipping around, you'll start to feel happier. Or then if you walk with like your eyes towards the ground, kind of hunched over and like short, small steps, you're probably not going to feel so good. So, again, those are just a couple of really simple ways to try to shift your mood from the negative towards the positive. If you're having a hard time overcoming some of the mental blocks we have sometimes, it's that concept of like fake it till you make it. Your body does that. When you fake it with your body, it starts to actually feel it, and then you'll make it and you'll feel happier. So, just some good advice there for you to try to help you with your moods and everything. Just like this says, you can use your understanding of feedback effects to become more empathic. Also, let your own face mimic another person's expressions if you're like talking with them. Acting as another acts helps us feel what another feels. So, just by mimicking someone else's facial expressions, you'll kind of start to internalize and feel what they are feeling and expressing to you as well. So that is it. I hope that you enjoyed this module here on our different theories of emotion and our emotional expressions. Use those pieces of advice, please. I think that they are great and can really help boost your mood sometimes. And look forward to seeing you all in class. Have an awesome rest of your day, everybody. Take care.